When Magnolia Hayes was sold to a poor Wyoming rancher as payment for her father's debts in 1879, she expected a life of hardship and servitude on a failing homestead. But as their wagon crested the hill, revealing 15,000 head of cattle stretching across an endless valley, she realized nothing about this arrangement was what it seemed, and neither was the quiet man who'd specifically asked for her. What had Daniel Morrison really paid for, and why had he chosen the woman everyone else considered worthless? The stagecoach wheels screamed against the rocky ground as they came to a sudden stop, throwing Magnolia Hayes forward so hard her teeth clicked together. Through the dusty window she could see nothing but empty land stretching forever under the blazing Wyoming sun of 1879. "Last stop, miss," the driver shouted from above. "Sweetwater Creek." Magnolia's hands shook as she gathered her only belongings, a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother and a small wooden box containing her few precious things. The other passengers had already gotten off at earlier towns, leaving her alone with her fears and the memory of her father's cold words echoing in her mind. "You're too much of a burden, Magnolia. At least this way, you'll have a roof over your head." She climbed down from the coach, her heavy frame making the step creak under her weight. The September heat hit her like a wall, and sweat immediately began forming under her thick brown dress. Around her, the small frontier town of Sweetwater Creek looked like something from a bad dream. Wooden buildings that seemed ready to fall over, dusty streets with more horses than people, and curious eyes watching her from every doorway. A group of women in fine dresses whispered behind their hands as they stared at her. Magnolia had heard it all before. The fat girl, the one nobody wanted, the daughter whose own father had to pay someone to take her away. "You must be Miss Hayes." The voice came from behind her, deep and calm. Magnolia turned around, expecting to see the cruel face that surely went with a man desperate enough to accept damaged goods in payment for a debt. Instead, she found herself looking at someone completely different. Daniel Morrison was tall but not towering, with sun-darkened skin and gray eyes that seemed to see everything without judging. His clothes were simple but clean worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen plenty of work but were well cared for. His hat was in his hands, showing dark brown hair that needed cutting. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Daniel Morrison. I've come to take you home." The word home hit her like a physical blow. She had never really had a home, not since her mother died when she was 12. Her father's house had become a place of shame and angry silences, where every meal felt like theft and every day was a reminder that she cost more than she was worth. I understand the arrangement," she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "My father explained everything." Something flickered across Daniel's face. Anger, maybe, or sadness. "I'm sure he did, but we can talk about all that later. Right now, let's get you out of this heat." He reached for her carpet bag, and she instinctively pulled back. Every man who had ever tried to help her had wanted something in return, and it was never anything good. "I can carry my own things," she said. "I know you can," Daniel replied gently. "But there's no shame in letting someone help, especially when they want to." The kindness in his voice almost broke her. She had been preparing for cruelty, for disappointment, for the look of regret that would surely come when he saw what he had really gotten in this deal. Instead, he simply waited patiently until she nodded and allowed him to take her bag. The walk to his wagon gave her a chance to study him more carefully. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, nodding politely to the townspeople they passed. She noticed that several people called out friendly greetings to him, and he responded to each one by name. "How long have you lived here, Mr. Morrison?" she asked as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. "About 10 years now. Came out here right after the war ended." He climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. "What about you? Have you always lived in Missouri?" The simple question surprised her. Most people didn't bother asking about her life, assuming there wasn't much worth knowing. "Yes, sir. Born and raised outside Kansas City." "Must be hard, leaving everything familiar behind." Magnolia almost laughed at that. Familiar, yes, but not beloved, not wanted. "Sometimes change is necessary," she said carefully. As the wagon rolled out of town, Daniel kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation. He pointed out landmarks, told her about the weather patterns, mentioned neighbors she might meet. Never once did he ask about the debt that had brought her here, or make her feel like she owed him explanations. The landscape around them was unlike anything she had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched to the horizon, broken by rocky outcroppings, and the occasional stand of trees following a creek bed. The sky seemed impossibly huge, a dome of blue so bright it almost hurt to look at. "It's beautiful," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "It grows on you," Daniel agreed. "When I first came out here, I thought it was the loneliest place on earth. All that empty space, all that silence. But after a while, you start to understand that it's not empty at all. It's full of possibilities." They rode in, comfortable, quiet for a while. The only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves. Magnolia found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, lulled by the rhythm of travel and the warm afternoon sun. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Morrison?" she said finally. "Of course. Why me?" The question had been burning inside her since she first learned about the arrangement. There must have been other ways to settle the debt. Daniel was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Your father owed me money, yes. But that's not why I asked for you specifically." Her heart began to race. "Then why?" He glanced at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite identify. "I saw you once, in town. You were with a church group, helping organize some kind of social gathering. You were kind to everyone, even the people others ignored. You made an old man laugh, and you helped a young mother with her crying baby without being asked." Magnolia remembered that day. It had been one of the few times her father had allowed her to come to town, and she had thrown herself into the church work with desperate enthusiasm, grateful for any chance to feel useful. "I watched you," Daniel continued, "and I thought to myself, there's a woman who knows how to make a place feel like home." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, but she was afraid to believe them. "And that's why you bought me?" The harsh word hung in the air between them, and she saw Daniel's jaw tighten. "I didn't buy you, Magnolia. I paid your father's debt, yes, but you're not property, and you never will be. You're here because I hoped you might want to stay." The wagon hit a rough patch of ground, jolting Magnolia from her spinning thoughts. Around them, the landscape had begun to change subtly. The grass seemed greener, the trees more numerous, and there was a sense of water nearby, even though she couldn't see any creeks. "We're almost to my land now," Daniel said, and she heard a note of pride in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. Up ahead, she could see what looked like a simple wooden gate stretched across the dirt road. As they got closer, she realized it was more elaborate than she had first thought. 2 sturdy posts supporting a heavy beam with something carved into it, though she couldn't make out the words yet. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the gate and climbed down to swing it open. The hinges moved smoothly, as if they were well maintained and used frequently. As he led the horses through, Magnolia finally saw what was carved into the beam above. "Morrison Ranch, Est 1869. "You have a real ranch," she said, and immediately felt foolish. Of course he had a ranch. What had she been expecting? "Small operation," Daniel said as he climbed back up beside her. "But it's growing." They continued down a dirt road that was surprisingly well maintained, with wooden posts marking the way. On either side, the grassland stretched away in gentle rolling hills. Magnolia began to notice things she had missed before. The grass here was definitely greener and thicker than what they had passed through earlier. There were more wildflowers scattered throughout, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees suggested reliable water sources. "How many cattle do you have?" she asked, trying to make conversation and show interest in his work. "Oh, a few," Daniel said, and something in his tone made her glance at him. He was concentrating on driving the wagon, but she caught what might have been a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They rounded a bend in the road, and suddenly, Magnolia could see buildings ahead, not just a single house, but what looked like a complete homestead. There was a main house, certainly, but also a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be a bunkhouse. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see people moving around in the distance. "Mr. Morrison," she said slowly, "this is much bigger than I expected. Like I said, the operation has been growing." He was definitely smiling now, though he was trying to hide it. I hope you don't mind. I know it might seem like a lot after town life. Magnolia stared at the scene before them, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had assumed about her situation. Her father had told her he was sending her to a poor rancher who needed a woman to cook and clean in exchange for room and board. This looked more like a successful business than a desperate homestead. As they drew closer to the main house, people began emerging from the various buildings. Magnolia counted at least 6 men, all dressed in the practical clothes of working cowboys. They called out friendly greetings to Daniel, and she noticed that their eyes were curious but respectful when they looked at her. "Boys," Daniel called back, "this is Miss Hayes. She'll be staying with us." "Ma'am?" several of them said, touching their hat brims politely. The house itself was larger than any she had ever lived in. A solid 2-story structure, with a wide front porch and real glass windows. Flowers grew in neat beds along the front, and she could see a large vegetable garden stretching out to one side. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully, then immediately worried that she sounded too eager, too grateful. She didn't want him to think she was here just for the comfort. "My mother always said a house isn't a home without flowers," Daniel said as he helped her down from the wagon. His hand was steady and warm as he supported her, and he didn't let go until he was sure she was stable on the ground. An older Mexican man came out of the house, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel. He was small and compact, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Pedro," Daniel said, "this is Miss Hayes. Miss Hayes, this is Pedro Valdez. He keeps us all fed and makes sure we don't track mud through the house." "Señorita," Pedro said with a slight bow, "welcome. I have supper almost ready, and I made extra in case you were hungry from traveling." The casual assumption that she would be hungry, without judgment, without that look that said fat people were always hungry, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back quickly. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Valdez." "Just Pedro, señorita. We are not fancy people here." Daniel picked up her carpet bag and gestured toward the house. "Let me show you where you'll be staying, and then we can eat. I imagine you're tired." The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. The front room was spacious and comfortable, with sturdy furniture and colorful rugs on the wooden floors. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but it had the lived-in feeling of a real home rather than a showplace. "I've prepared the room upstairs for you," Daniel said, leading her up a staircase that didn't creak under their combined weight. "It has a window facing east, so you'll get the morning light." The bedroom he showed her was larger than any she had ever had to herself. A real bed, with a quilted coverlet, a dresser with a mirror, a comfortable chair by the window, and even a small writing desk. Clean white curtains framed the window, and someone had put fresh wildflowers in a jar on the dresser. "I'll let you get settled," Daniel said, setting her bag on the bed. "Come down whenever you're ready, no hurry." After he left, Magnolia sat heavily on the edge of the bed, trying to process everything that had happened since stepping off the stagecoach. Nothing about this situation matched what she had been told to expect. The man was kind instead of desperate. The house was prosperous instead of poor. She was being treated as a guest instead of as payment for a debt. She opened her carpet bag and began unpacking her few belongings, hanging her 2 extra dresses in the wardrobe and placing her mother's Bible and her small jewelry box on the dresser. The room seemed to swallow her possessions, making her realize how little she actually owned. From the window, she could see the barn and the other outbuildings, and beyond them, pasture land that stretched further than she had imagined. In the distance, she thought she could see dark shapes that might be cattle, though they were too far away to be sure. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Hayes?" It was Daniel's voice. "Pedro says supper is ready whenever you are." "I'll be right down," she called back, quickly checking her appearance in the mirror and smoothing her hair. The kitchen was warm and filled with wonderful smells. Pedro had prepared what seemed like enough food for twice as many people as she had seen: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, green beans from the garden, and apple pie cooling on the windowsill. "I hope you don't mind eating in the kitchen," Daniel said as he held a chair for her. "The dining room feels too formal for everyday meals." "This is perfect," Magnolia said, and meant it. The kitchen table was scarred from years of use, but it was clean and sturdy, and the sight of all that food made her stomach growl audibly. Daniel pretended not to notice, serving her generous portions without comment. Pedro bustled around, making sure they had everything they needed, chattering cheerfully about the garden and the weather and plans for preserving vegetables for the winter. "Pedro," Daniel said during a pause in the older man's monologue, "Miss Hayes will be staying with us permanently. Do you think you could show her around tomorrow? Introduce her to how we do things here?" "Of course," Pedro beamed at Magnolia. "I have been managing this house alone for too long. It will be good to have another pair of hands, especially hands that know women's work." The assumption that she would be working, contributing, being useful, rather than just existing as a burden, was like a weight lifting from her chest. "I'd be happy to help however I can." As they ate, Daniel told her more about the ranch, how he had started with just a few cattle and built up the herd over the years, how he had gradually acquired more land, how he had found and hired good men to help with the work. He spoke with quiet pride but without boasting, and Magnolia found herself genuinely interested in hearing about his success. "What about you?" he asked as Pedro served the pie. "What kind of work did you do back in Missouri?" It was a simple question, but one that no one had bothered to ask her in years. "I kept house for my father after my mother died. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I also helped some of the neighbor ladies with their preserving and their sewing when they needed extra hands." "Good skills to have out here," Daniel said approvingly. "Pedro does his best, but there are some things that need a woman's touch." After supper, as Pedro cleared the dishes and Daniel excused himself to check on the animals one more time before dark, Magnolia stood on the front porch and looked out at her new surroundings. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The air was cooling, and she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the soft nickering of horses in the corral. For the first time in her adult life, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in her chest. But even as she allowed herself to enjoy the feeling, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings. Things that seemed too good to be true usually were, and she had learned through painful experience that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, as Daniel's footsteps approached the porch and his quiet presence settled beside her in the gathering darkness, Magnolia couldn't quite bring herself to push the feeling away entirely. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Something was very wrong with this picture. Magnolia gripped the wooden wagon seat so hard her knuckles turned white as they rolled over the hill's crest. Below them spread a sight that made her stomach flip like a fish out of water. Cattle, everywhere. Black dots moving across green grass like ants on a picnic blanket, stretching so far they seemed to touch the mountains themselves. The sound hit her next, a deep rumbling like distant thunder, but it never stopped. Thousands of animals calling to each other across the valley. "Sweet heavens above," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wagon wheels. "How many are there?" Daniel's hands stayed steady on the reins, but she caught the tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Lost count somewhere past 15,000 head. Maybe more by now with the spring calves." 15,000. The number bounced around in her head like a rubber ball. Back home in Missouri, old Farmer Jenkins bragged about his 30 head of cattle. 30. And here was Daniel Morrison, the man her father claimed was so poor he needed a wife given away like an old coat, sitting next to enough beef to feed half the country. The wagon wheels found a smoother path down into the valley, and Magnolia's mind raced faster than the horse's hooves. Nothing made sense. If Daniel owned all this, why had her father acted like he was doing charity work? Why had he spoken of Daniel like he was some desperate bachelor who couldn't find a wife any other way? A group of riders approached them, men in dusty clothes with hats pulled low against the sun. Cowboys. Real ones, not the drifters and troublemakers she'd seen in town. These men sat their horses like they belonged there, like they'd grown up in the saddle. "Afternoon, boss," called the nearest rider, a young man with freckles and a gap-toothed grin. "Everything look good from town?" "Good enough, Tommy," Daniel replied. "Meet my wife, Magnolia." "Magnolia? This is Tommy Clearwater. He's my head wrangler." Wife. The word hung in the air like morning mist. Magnolia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Tommy just touched his hat brim respectfully. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am. We got the east pasture ready for the new herd coming up from Texas. Should arrive next week if the weather holds. Another herd. More cattle. Magnolia's head spun, trying to imagine how much money moved through this valley every year. And Daniel Morrison controlled all of it, with quiet words and steady hands. As they rode away from the cowboys, the ranch house came into view. Magnolia had expected something grand, maybe not a mansion, but at least something that showed off all this wealth. Instead, she saw a simple wooden house, maybe 6 rooms, with a covered porch and flower boxes under the windows. Clean white paint and a red roof, but nothing fancy. "It's not much to look at," Daniel said, following her gaze. "Built it myself when I first came here. Always figured I'd add on to it when." He stopped talking and cleared his throat. "When what?" Magnolia wanted to ask, but something in his voice made her hold back. They pulled up in front of the house, and Daniel climbed down first, then offered his hand to help her. His palm was rough from work, but his touch was gentle. The inside of the house surprised her again. Everything was clean and neat, but clearly done by a man living alone. The furniture looked comfortable, but plain. Books filled a shelf by the fireplace, more books than most folks owned. The kitchen had good pots and pans, but dust on the fancy china plates that sat unused on high shelves. "I tried to get things ready," Daniel said, suddenly sounding nervous. "Mrs. Henderson from town came by yesterday to help clean up. Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. I fixed the window latch and put in fresh curtains." Her room, not their room. Magnolia felt a mix of relief and confusion. What kind of arrangement was this? A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Daniel opened it to reveal an older Mexican man with silver hair and kind eyes. "Senor Morrison, I have dinner ready whenever you wish. And welcome, Senora," he said to Magnolia with a small bow. "Magnolia, meet Pedro Santos. He's been cooking for me and the hands for about 3 years now. Pedro, this is my wife, Magnolia." Pedro's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Ah, finally. The boss, he is too skinny. Now we have a proper lady to make sure he eats well." After Pedro left to finish preparing dinner, Daniel turned to her with that same nervous energy she'd noticed before. "I know this is all strange," he said. "Your father, he didn't explain much about how things would work here. I want you to know that you're safe here. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. For as long as she wanted. Not forever. Not whether she liked it or not. As long as she chose to stay." The words wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket on a cold night. Through the window, she could see the sun setting over the valley, painting the sky orange and pink. The cattle looked peaceful now, scattered across the grass like dark stones in a green river. In the distance, she could see the bunkhouse where the cowboys lived, smoke rising from its chimney. "Daniel," she said quietly, "why did you really ask for me?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at his land. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft as evening wind. "Because I was tired of being alone." The sound of galloping horses at sunrise was never good news. Magnolia jerked awake in her bed as hoofbeats thundered into the ranch yard, followed by men's voices raised in urgent conversation. Through her bedroom window, she could see 3 riders on lathered horses, their faces grim in the early morning light. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs, where she found Daniel already on the front porch, his coffee cup forgotten on the railing. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, tall and thin, with a beard that needed trimming and eyes that darted around like a cornered animal. "Morrison, we got trouble," the stranger called out before his horse had even stopped moving. "Big trouble heading this way." Magnolia stepped closer to the screen door, trying to hear without being seen. In her 3 weeks at the ranch, life had been peaceful as a Sunday morning. Daniel worked with his cattle. She'd started a garden behind the house, and Pedro cooked meals that made her feel like she was part of a real family. But now tension filled the air thick as storm clouds. "Settle down, Briggs," Daniel said calmly. "Get down from that horse and tell me what's got you spooked." The man called Briggs swung down from his saddle, and Magnolia could see his hands shaking as he tied the reins to the porch post. The other 2 riders stayed mounted, their rifles across their saddles. "It's Wade Coulter," Briggs said, his voice dropping low. "He's been making the rounds to all the small ranchers, telling them you've been stealing water that rightfully belongs to everyone. Says you're hogging the best grazing land and driving up the price of beef so the little guys can't compete." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "And what do you think, Briggs? I think Coulter's full of hot air and bad whiskey, Briggs replied. But he's got some folks convinced. Johnson and his boys have already thrown in with him. So have the Miller brothers and that new family that settled near Willow Creek. They're talking about banding together to force you to sell your water rights. From her hiding spot behind the door, Magnolia felt her stomach drop. She'd heard stories about range wars, about what happened when neighbors turned against each other over land and water. It never ended well for anyone. How many men is Coulter gathering? Daniel asked. Maybe 20 so far. But he's promising easy money to anyone who joins up. Says once they run you off, they can divide up your land and cattle among themselves. The second rider, a boy who couldn't have been older than 18, spoke up for the first time. Mr. Morrison, my pa sent me to warn you. He says Coulter's planning to make his move soon. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But soon. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the problem. I appreciate the warning, son. You tell your father I won't forget this kindness. After the riders left, Daniel came back inside to find Magnolia waiting in the kitchen. She'd made fresh coffee and set out plates for breakfast, but her hands trembled as she poured the steaming liquid. You heard all that, he said. It wasn't a question. Hard not to, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Is it as bad as it sounds? Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen table, suddenly looking older than his years. Wade Coulter's been causing trouble for months. He came out here from Kansas 2 years ago with big plans and no money to back them up. His ranch failed, and now he's looking for someone to blame. But why you? Because I have what he wants. Daniel's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. Water rights, good grazing land, a herd that's worth more than most small towns. In his mind, it's not fair that one man should have so much when others are struggling. Magnolia sat across from him, studying his face. In the morning light, she could see the worry lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. What happens if they come here? They won't get past the front gate, Daniel said firmly. I've got 12 good men working for me, and every one of them knows how to handle a rifle. Plus, I've got friends in town, people who know the truth about Coulter's lies. But as the day wore on, more bad news trickled in. Tommy Clearwater rode back from checking the north pasture with word that someone had cut the fence line and scattered nearly 100 head of cattle. Pedro returned from town with stories of men asking questions about Daniel's business, about how many hands he employed, about the best ways to approach the ranch house. By evening, Daniel had positioned men at key points around the property. Magnolia watched from the kitchen window as cowboys took up positions behind the barn, in the hayloft, and along the ridge that overlooked the main road. Their movements were quick and professional, like soldiers preparing for battle. You should pack a bag, Daniel said, coming up behind her. Just in case. Pack a bag? Magnolia turned to face him, confusion and fear warring in her chest. Where would I go? Tommy can take you to town tonight. Mrs. Henderson would put you up until this is over. The suggestion hit her like a slap. After 3 weeks of feeling like she finally belonged somewhere, he wanted to send her away at the first sign of trouble. No, she said firmly. Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Magnolia, this could get dangerous. If shooting starts, then I'll keep my head down and help however I can, she interrupted. This is my home now, Daniel Morrison. You said so yourself, and I don't run from my home. Something shifted in his expression, a look she couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe, or respect. It's not going to be like anything you've ever experienced, he warned. These aren't gentlemen having a disagreement. If Coulter comes, he'll come with violence on his mind. Magnolia thought about her life before this place, the years of being treated like a burden, of overhearing whispered conversations about what to do with the fat girl who couldn't find a husband. She'd spent so long feeling worthless that she'd almost believed it herself. But here, in this house, with this quiet man who treated her like she mattered, she'd found something worth fighting for. Then we'll be ready for him, she said. The sound of breaking glass shattered Magnolia's dreams at dawn. She bolted upright in her narrow bed, heart pounding like a wild horse's hooves. Outside her window, angry voices cut through the morning air like knives through butter. Morrison, get out here, you cattle thief. Daniel's boots thundered across the wooden floor of the main house. Magnolia pressed her face to the cold window and gasped. 20 men on horseback surrounded their home, rifles glinting in the early sunlight. Their leader sat tall in his saddle, a mean-looking man with a black mustache and eyes like winter ice. "Stay inside, Magnolia," Daniel called as he stepped onto the porch. His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. He held his rifle loose in his hands, ready but not threatening. "Not yet." The black-mustached man spat into the dust. "Jeb Coulter's the name. These here, boys and me. We got a problem with you, Morrison." "What kind of problem?" Daniel asked. His voice carried across the yard like he was asking about the weather. "The kind where you got 15,000 head of cattle, and we got families going hungry." Coulter's horse pranced sideways, sensing its rider's anger. "Word is you been buying up water rights, cutting off the small ranchers downstream." Magnolia's stomach twisted. She'd heard whispers in town about water troubles, but Daniel had never mentioned it. Had she been so caught up in her own happiness that she'd missed something important? "Those water rights were bought fair and square," Daniel replied. "Been filing the papers proper for 10 years now." "Fair?" Coulter laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Fair is when honest folk can water their stock without paying you tribute money." Through her window, Magnolia watched more riders appear on the ridge behind the house. Her mouth went dry. They were surrounded. One of Coulter's men shifted in his saddle. "Boss, sun's getting higher. Townfolk will be stirring soon." "Then we better settle this quick." Coulter raised his rifle. "Morrison, you got two choices. Sign over half them water rights, or we take 'em ourselves." Daniel's knuckles went white on his weapon. "And if I refuse both options? Then your widow can decide what to do with all them cows." The word widow hit Magnolia like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stop a cry from escaping. These men weren't just here to threaten. They were here to kill. "I got a woman in that house," Daniel said quietly. "She's got nothing to do with this." "Fat lot we care about your cook," sneered one of the riders. "She's not my cook." Daniel's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "She's my wife." Magnolia's heart skipped. Wife? They'd never spoken such words, never made such promises. But hearing Daniel claim her that way, in front of armed men who meant them harm, made something fierce and protective bloom in her chest. Coulter spat again. "Even better. Widows sell out faster than bachelors." The first shot came from the ridge behind the house. The bullet splintered the porch rail inches from Daniel's left hand. He dove sideways, rolling behind a water trough as more shots rang out. "Get down!" he shouted toward the house. Magnolia dropped below the windowsill, but she could still hear everything. Boots running across gravel, men shouting orders, horses whinnying in fear, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the hills. A bullet punched through the thin wall above her head, showering her with splinters. Another shattered the mirror on her dresser. She crawled toward the door, staying low, her nightgown catching on the rough floorboards. The kitchen window exploded inward, glass raining down on the breakfast table, where she and Daniel had shared coffee just yesterday morning, where he'd smiled at her over his eggs and asked about her plans for the garden. "Daniel!" she called, but her voice was lost in the chaos. More shots. A man screaming in pain somewhere outside. The smell of gunpowder drifting through the broken windows like bitter smoke. Magnolia reached the kitchen and found Daniel's spare rifle hanging on pegs by the door. Her hands shook as she lifted it down. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, but she'd watched her brothers hunt back in Missouri. She knew which end was which. Through the shattered window, she could see Daniel behind the water trough, calmly reloading his rifle, while bullets whistled overhead. His hat had fallen off, and his dark hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. One of Coulter's men was creeping around the side of the house, using the chicken coop for cover. Daniel couldn't see him from his position, but Magnolia could. She'd never shot at a person before, never even thought about it. But watching that man sneak closer to her husband, and yes, she realized with crystal clarity, Daniel was her husband in every way that mattered, made the decision simple. The rifle's kick nearly knocked her backward, but her shot went true. The man behind the chicken coop yelped and grabbed his shoulder, his own weapon flying from his hands. "Nice shot, wife," Daniel called, and even in the middle of a gunfight she heard pride in his voice. Wife. The word wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. The gunfight had been raging for 2 hours when Magnolia heard something that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats. More riders coming hard from the east, dust clouds rising behind them like storm fronts. "Daniel," she called through the broken kitchen window. "More coming." He was still crouched behind the water trough, his shirt torn and bloody from flying splinters. How many? Magnolia squinted through the morning haze. The riders were still too far away to count, but there were a lot of them. Maybe more than Coulter had brought. Her heart sank. They were already outnumbered 3-1. More attackers would finish them for sure. But as the horses drew closer, she noticed something strange. These riders weren't shooting. They weren't even spreading out like fighters. They were riding straight and fast, like men with a purpose that didn't involve bullets. "Daniel," she called again, excitement creeping into her voice. I think they might be help." The lead rider was close enough now for her to make out his face. Old Pete Hawkins from the next ranch over. Behind him rode Tom Bradley, whose wife brought pies to church socials. And there was young Billy Chen, whose family ran the general store in town. "Coulter!" Pete's voice boomed across the valley like thunder. "Stand down!" The shooting stopped, as if someone had blown out a candle. The sudden quiet felt strange after so much noise. Even the birds had stopped singing. Jeb Coulter urged his horse forward to meet the newcomers. "This ain't your fight, Hawkins." "Like hell it ain't." Pete's horse snorted and pawed the ground. "Morrison's been fair to every rancher in this territory. You got a beef with water rights, you take it to the territorial judge, not settle it with guns." "The judge is 3 days' ride away," Coulter snarled. "Meanwhile, my cattle are dying of thirst." Tom Bradley spoke up. "Your cattle are dying because you spent your water money on whiskey instead of drilling proper wells." A murmur went through both groups of riders. Magnolia pressed closer to the window, straining to hear every word. "That's a lie," Coulter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Billy Chen's young voice carried surprising authority. "Because my father keeps the books for the drilling company. You ordered 3 wells dug last spring, then canceled the work when the saloon opened that new poker room." More murmurs, these ones angry. Some of Coulter's own men were looking at their leader with doubt in their eyes. Pete Hawkins pressed his advantage. "Morrison here has helped half the ranchers in Wyoming territory get started. Loaned money without interest, shared grazing land during dry seasons, even gave away breeding bulls to improve herds. You want to kill a man like that over your own poor choices?" One of Coulter's riders, a young man Magnolia didn't recognize, lowered his rifle. "Pete's right, Jeb. Morrison helped my family when the fever took our stock 2 years back. Didn't ask for nothing in return." "Shut up, Tommy," Coulter snapped. But other voices were joining in now. Stories about Daniel's kindness, his fairness, his willingness to help neighbors in trouble. Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes, hearing these men describe the gentle, generous nature she'd come to love. "You're all fools," Coulter said, but his support was crumbling like a dam in flood season. 3 more of his men holstered their weapons and backed their horses away from the confrontation. Daniel stood up slowly from behind the water trough, his rifle still ready but pointed at the ground. "Jeb, you and your boys can water your stock at my wells anytime you need to. Always could. All you had to do was ask instead of shooting up my home." Coulter's face went red as a summer sunset. "I ain't taking charity from no—" "It's not charity," Daniel interrupted. "It's being neighbors." The word hung in the air like morning mist. Neighbors. Such a simple thing, but Magnolia understood its power. In this harsh land where winter could kill and drought could ruin, neighbors meant survival. More of Coulter's men were backing away now, their faces embarrassed. They'd come here ready to kill over a misunderstanding, stirred up by a leader who'd gambled away his ranch's future. Pete Hawkins rode closer to Coulter. "You got 2 choices, Jeb. Ride out now and we forget this ever happened. Or keep pushing and find out how many friends Morrison really has in this territory." As if to underscore his point, more riders appeared on the horizon. The territorial sheriff and his deputies, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their badges glinted in the morning sun like stars. Coulter looked around at his dwindling support, at the growing number of men who opposed him, at the lawmen approaching with handcuffs ready. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "This ain't over, Morrison," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Yes, it is," Daniel replied quietly. "Come by tomorrow if you want to talk about water shares. Bring your account books. We'll work something out." Even in victory, he was offering mercy. Magnolia's heart swelled with pride and love so fierce it took her breath away. As Coulter and his remaining followers rode away, The tension drained from the morning like water from a broken bucket. The neighborhood men who'd come to help began dismounting, checking Daniel for injuries, shaking his hand, clapping his back. Through it all, Magnolia watched from her broken window and understood something profound. She'd spent her whole life believing she was alone, unwanted, a burden to be endured. But Daniel Morrison had built something bigger than a cattle ranch. He'd built a community, a network of people who looked out for each other. And somehow, impossibly, she was part of it now. A gunshot cracked through the dawn air, but this time it wasn't aimed at enemies. Daniel was putting down a horse with a broken leg, and Magnolia watched from the kitchen window as he knelt beside the fallen animal with genuine sorrow in his eyes. 3 weeks had passed since the attack. 3 weeks of uneasy quiet that felt more dangerous than the shooting itself. Another one, Pedro muttered from behind her, shaking his grizzled head as he kneaded bread dough with angry force. That's the third horse this month with mysterious injuries. Magnolia turned from the window, her stomach tight with worry. You think someone's doing this on purpose? Senora, in my 60 years I've seen many accidents. These, he gestured toward the window where Daniel was covering the horse with a tarp. These are not accidents. The front door slammed, and Daniel's heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face was darker than she'd ever seen it. Mud caked his boots, and blood stained his shirt sleeves, not his own blood, but the horse's. We need to talk, he said quietly, but his voice carried an edge that made Magnolia's heart skip. Both of you. They gathered around the kitchen table like conspirators, the morning light casting long shadows across their worried faces. Daniel pulled out a folded piece of paper and smoothed it flat between them. Magnolia gasped. It was a notice from the territorial government, official-looking and stamped with important seals. Water rights hearing, Daniel read aloud. Next Monday in Cheyenne. Someone's claiming I don't have legal access to Willow Creek. Pedro's weathered hands stilled on his bread dough. But your father dug that irrigation channel before you were born, yes? 23 years ago, Daniel confirmed, his jaw clenched. But apparently the original surveyor made some mistakes. Or so they claim. He looked up at Magnolia, and she saw fear there, not for himself, but for everything they'd built together. Without that water, we lose half the grazing land. Maybe more. Magnolia reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His skin was rough from years of hard work, familiar now in ways that made her chest tight with emotion. Who would do this? Who benefits if you lose the water rights? Clayton Moorcock, Daniel said, and the name fell between them like a stone into still water. He's been buying up struggling ranches all over the territory, made me 3 offers in the past 5 years, each one higher than the last. And each one you refused, Magnolia added, remembering the conversation she'd overheard. This land isn't for sale. Daniel's voice was firm, but she could hear the doubt creeping in. But if we lose that water access, we'll have to sell half the herd just to survive the winter, and once we start selling. Pedro wiped his flour-covered hands on his apron and stood up slowly. There might be another way, he said carefully. My nephew Roberto works for the surveyor's office in Cheyenne. He hears things. Daniel leaned forward, hope flickering in his storm-gray eyes. What kind of things? The kind that might help us understand how a 23-year-old water claim suddenly becomes questionable. Pedro's expression was grim but determined. But it would mean a trip to the capital, and it would mean leaving the ranch unprotected. Magnolia felt something cold settle in her stomach. You think they're planning something while you're gone? I think, Daniel said slowly, that this hearing is meant to get me away from here. The question is why. Over the next hour, they planned like generals preparing for war. Pedro would ride to Cheyenne immediately to meet with his nephew and gather information. Daniel would follow 2 days later for the hearing, taking only Tom Bradley, his most trusted hand. That left Magnolia at the ranch with the remaining workers, good men, but not gunfighters. I should come with you, Magnolia argued for the 3rd time as Daniel checked his rifle. If this is a trap, then I need to know you're safe, Daniel interrupted, his voice gentle but unyielding. Besides, someone needs to watch the ranch, someone I trust completely. The words warmed her, even as fear coiled in her stomach. Trust, such a simple word, but no one had ever given it to her so freely before. What if Moorcock sends men while you're gone? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen cabinet and pulled out a small wooden box she'd never seen before. Inside, nestled in red velvet, lay a silver locket and a folded letter. "This was my mother's," he said, lifting the locket with careful fingers. "And this," he held up the letter, "is something I should have given you weeks ago." Magnolia's hands trembled as she took the locket. It was beautiful, delicate, engraved with tiny flowers that caught the light. "Daniel, I can't." "Yes, you can." He moved behind her to fasten the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin in a way that made her shiver. "My mother wore this every day for 30 years. She said it brought her luck and kept her safe when my father was away on cattle drives." The metal was warm against her throat, and Magnolia touched it gently. "What about the letter?" Daniel's cheeks actually colored slightly. "I wrote it the night you arrived. Everything I wanted to say but couldn't find the courage for." He cleared his throat. Maybe you could read it while I'm gone. And when I come back, we can talk about what it says." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, not quite a kiss, but more than friendly affection. The gesture was so tender, so full of unspoken promises, that Magnolia felt tears prick her eyes. "I'll come back," he said against her hair. "I promise you that." "You better," she whispered, surprised by the fierce protectiveness in her own voice. "Because if Clayton Moorcock thinks he can steal what's ours, he's about to learn otherwise." Daniel pulled back to look at her, and something in his expression shifted. "Ours," he repeated softly. "Ours," Magnolia confirmed, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As evening approached and Daniel prepared for his early morning departure, Magnolia found herself standing in their bedroom, for she'd begun thinking of it that way, holding his letter and trying to gather the courage to open it. Through the window, she could see him talking quietly with the hands, giving final instructions and preparing them for whatever might come. The locket felt heavy around her neck, but it was a good weight, the weight of belonging, of being trusted with something precious. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges lay ahead in Cheyenne or here at the ranch, she was no longer the unwanted girl her father had sold to pay his debts. She was Magnolia Morrison, and she would fight for her home. The letter fell from Magnolia's trembling fingers as hoofbeats thundered toward the house, but these weren't the threatening riders she'd expected. Tom Bradley's horse was lathered with sweat and foam, and the young cowboy was shouting before he'd even dismounted. "Mrs. Morrison, they arrested him. They arrested Daniel." Magnolia's world tilted sideways as she rushed from the porch to catch Tom's arm. "What do you mean arrested? For what?" "Cattle theft," Tom gasped, still catching his breath from his hard ride. "That snake Moorcock claimed Daniel stole 50 head from his north pasture, had a sheriff waiting right outside the courthouse with witnesses and everything." The words hit her like physical blows. Cattle theft was a hanging offense in Wyoming territory, and everyone knew it. Her hands shook as she helped Tom toward the house. "That's impossible. Daniel's been building this herd for 10 years. He wouldn't." "Course he wouldn't." Tom's face was flushed with anger and exhaustion. But Moorcock had 3 men swear they saw Daniel's hands driving cattle across his property last week, even had fresh brands to show the judge. Pedro appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grave. "How long do we have?" "Trial's set for Thursday morning," Tom said, accepting the cup of water Pedro offered. "That's 4 days from now. But here's the strange part. Moorcock's men are already moving cattle onto our south pasture, acting like they own it." Magnolia felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest, not fear this time, but fury. "They planned this," she said quietly. "The water rights hearing was just to get Daniel away from the ranch. Now they're trying to steal everything while he's locked up." She walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the vast expanse of land that had become her home. Thousands of cattle dotted the valley, each one representing years of Daniel's hard work and careful planning. The thought of losing it all to Clayton Moorcock's greed made her stomach burn with rage. "Tom," she said without turning around, "how many of our hands are still here?" "7, ma'am, plus Pedro and myself." "And how many men does Moorcock have?" Tom was quiet for a moment. 20, maybe 25. "But Mrs. Morrison, surely you're not thinking—" "I'm thinking," Magnolia interrupted, "that Clayton Moorcock made one very big mistake. He thought that taking Daniel would leave this ranch helpless." She turned to face them, and both men stepped back at the determination blazing in her eyes. He forgot about me. Over the next hour, Magnolia did something she'd never done before in her life. She took charge. Not hesitantly, not apologetically, but with the kind of quiet authority that made grown men listen and nod. She sent Pedro to town with instructions to find a lawyer, any lawyer, willing to take on Moorcock's influence. She dispatched 2 hands to neighboring ranches to spread word about what was happening and ask for help. "What about the cattle they're moving onto our land?" Tom asked. Magnolia was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Daniel's letter lay on the kitchen table where she'd dropped it, and she could see part of the first line. "My dearest Magnolia, from the moment I first saw you." The words gave her strength, reminded her that she was fighting not just for land or cattle, but for love itself. "We're going to move them right back," she said finally. Tom's eyes widened. "Ma'am, that's dangerous. Moorcock's men are armed, and they're not going to just stand by and watch." "Then we'll have to be smarter than them." Magnolia moved to the gun cabinet and pulled out Daniel's second-best rifle. "Pedro, how well do you know the old mining trails in the northern hills?" The elderly Mexican's eyes lit up with understanding. "Like the back of my hand, Senora. My father worked those mines before the silver played out." "Good. Because we're going to use those trails to move our cattle to the winter pastures early. All of them. If Moorcock wants this land, he can have empty grass." It was a desperate plan, born of desperation and fierce love, but as Magnolia explained her thinking, she could see hope dawning in the men's faces. The northern pastures were higher, rockier, harder to access, but they were also harder to steal. And if they could get the herd moved before Moorcock realized what was happening, it might actually work, Tom said slowly, but we'd have to move fast and quiet. "Then we start tonight," Magnolia decided, while Moorcock's men are celebrating their easy victory. As darkness fell over the Wyoming territory, something unprecedented happened on the Morrison ranch. Under cover of moonlight and guided by Pedro's knowledge of forgotten trails, a small group of determined people began the largest cattle drive in the ranch's history. Magnolia rode point alongside Tom, her skirts tucked up for practicality and Daniel's rifle across her saddle. She'd never driven cattle before, had barely ridden a horse until 3 months ago, but desperation and love made her bold. When a stubborn steer tried to break away from the group, she was there to turn him back. When Pedro's old bones started aching from the long ride, she took over his position without being asked. "You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Morrison," Tom said during a brief rest, his voice full of newfound respect. "I'm tougher than I thought I was," Magnolia replied, surprised by the truth of it. They worked through the night and into the next day, moving cattle in small groups to avoid attention. It was backbreaking. Dangerous work. Mountain trails were treacherous in daylight and nearly impossible in darkness. But every cow they moved was a victory. Every mile covered a declaration that the Morrison ranch would not go down without a fight. On the second day, as they pushed the last group of cattle up a particularly steep trail, Pedro suddenly held up his hand for silence. In the distance, barely visible through the pine trees, they could see riders approaching the ranch house. "Moorcock's men," Tom whispered. "They're figuring out what we're doing." Magnolia watched the distant figures for a long moment, then made a decision that would have terrified the woman she'd been 6 months ago. "Pedro, take the cattle onto the high pasture. Tom and I are going back." "Senora, that's my home," Magnolia said firmly. "And I'll be damned if I'm going to hide in the mountains while they steal it." As they rode back toward the ranch house, Magnolia touched the silver locket at her throat and thought about Daniel, sitting in a jail cell in Cheyenne and trusting her to protect what they'd built together. She thought about the letter still lying unread on the kitchen table, full of words she desperately wanted to hear. Most of all, she thought about the woman she'd become since arriving in this wild, beautiful place, a woman who knew her own worth, who fought for what she loved, who refused to be anyone's victim ever again. Clayton Moorcock was about to learn that he'd picked the wrong ranch to steal and the wrong woman to underestimate.